Exciting archaeology news from England. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence that a house in England is the site of the lost residence of the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. By reinterpreting previous excavations and conducting new surveys, they believe they have located a power center belonging to Harald Godwinson, famously killed in the Battle of Hastings in 1066. So, in this video, I'm going to explain who Harold was and the significance of the new study for understanding power in the early Middle Ages. Harald Godwinson is a very interesting character. He was unfortunately long remembered as a failure, however, he had long been one of the leading magnates in England. Fought against the Welsh quite successfully, he came from a very prominent family, and he was really the power behind the English throne, at least in the time of Edward the Confessor. He remained, however, in the shadow of Edward. He was always regarded as a saint, holy person, until the 19th century when Edward became known as a weakling in the Victorian perception, at least in comparison to the more manly Old English heroes, to which also Harold pertained. To understand where Harold was coming from, we need to go a bit back to the time of Canute the Great. You might have heard of him, the Danish prince who seized the English throne in 1016 after defeating Edmund Ironside. To legitimize his power and stabilize the transition from the English to Danish control, he married Queen Emma of Normandy, the widow of the former king Ethelred the Unready. Godwin belonged to a group that rise to power during the reign of Canute. Canute was determined to legitimize his power, and in order to do so, he needed the support of parts of aristocracy. So he chose to promote new favored people from, let's say, not the first line of aristocracy, but just below this line. He also pertained to a traditional English family, and because of the fact that he owed his position to Canute, this meant that he was very loyal to him, and this would have also allowed him to increase his influence at court, which he actually did. The family amassed huge wealth, but also symbolic centers in southern England. Let's remember the fact that England was quite centralized by 1060, but it was still a recent creation, and the power was largely focused in the area of roughly Winchester and later on London. Godwin also married into a Danish family. So he is very much connected to this multicultural world that was taking shape. He was looking towards Scandinavia as potential alliances. Unlike him, Edward the Confessor was rather oriented towards Norman families. So the Godwinsons kind of navigated this world between the north and France. Back to Knut, his dynasty was quite fragile. He had a son with Emma of Normandy, Harthacnut, as well as two sons with Eilvu of Northampton, Sweyn and Harold Harefoot. This division led to further succession disputes after his death in 1035. Sweyn is quickly out of the picture, and the English nobility ultimately backed Harold Harefoot, who became king in 1037, forcing Emma into exile. She did attempt to bring her sons from her first marriage, Edward and Alfred, back to England to lay claims on the English throne. However, Harold Harefoot's allies, including the powerful Earl Godwin, intercepted Alfred. He was captured, brutally blinded, and left to die from his wounds. Edward, realizing the danger, fled back to Normandy. However, Harold Harefoot's rule was short lived. He died suddenly in 1040, which allowed Harthacnut to return and claim the throne. However, he only ruled for 2 years until 1042, and he also died without an heir, leaving England once again in desperate need of a king. So, time for Edward the Confessor to shine. He was invited to take the throne. He had spent much of his life in Normandy, had Norman sympathies, but he was politically weak. So, his reign was essentially dominated by this very powerful family of the Godwinsons, particularly by Earl Godwin, who had backed Harold Harefoot and played a key role in Alfred's murder. To solidify the Godwinsons' power, Edward was pressured into marrying the daughter of Godwin, Edith, but the marriage remained childless, deepening England's succession crisis. And we do have indications that Edward was actually in search of a new wife, but that was very much to the disadvantage of the Godwinsons. So the relationship between Edward and the Godwinsons was very much strained. In 1051, Edward actually attempts to curb their power by exiling Godwin and his family, but they return the next year, forcing Edward to restore all their lands and influence. After Godwin's death in 1053, the leadership of the family passed to his son, Harold, who became the most powerful noble in all of England. Meanwhile, Harold's brother Tostig was appointed Earl of Northumbria in 1055, but he was deeply unpopular with the Northumbrians due to his harsh rule and high taxation, which is generally speaking a bad idea. So in 1065, they rebelled and expelled him. Surprisingly, Harold did not support his brother, instead siding with the rebels, which led to Tostig's exile in Flanders. And this betrayal would later have significant consequences. The Godwinsons were actually not that good of a friend to each other. They very much hated what the other one was doing, and they also sought a bit more power inside the family itself. So by 1066, Edward was old, he had no heirs, and the lack of a clear successor created a power vacuum that would soon be contested by multiple claimants, including Harold Godwinson, William of Normandy, and Harald Hardrada, or Hardrada in English, of Norway, setting the stage for the dramatic events of that year. In the meantime, in the 10th and 11th century, the Dukes of Normandy worked to strengthen their power, for example, by appointing relatives to key positions such as church officials or regional counts. When Emma's brother, Duke Richard II of Normandy, died, his son Robert became the new Duke. He never married, but he did acknowledge his illegitimate son William as his heir. Before embarking on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, he made his nobles swear loyalty to William. Robert died on the journey, leaving the young William as Duke at the age of 7. By the 1050s, William had firmly secured his control over Normandy and honed his military and political skills. While there isn't really any contemporary record of it, Norman sources suggest that Edward considered naming William as his heir. However, he ultimately did not make a final decision on the matter. Edward the Confessor also sought out the heirs of his half brother Edmund Ironside, who had been king briefly in 1016. The younger surviving son, Edward the Exile, had ended up in Hungary, where he married and had children. In 1057, Edward the Exile and his family were persuaded to come to England, but soon after the arrival, Edward died unexpectedly. King Edward then took care of the surviving children, and it seems he did intend to name Edward the Exile's son Edgar Atheling as the heir, as suggested by his name. One of the most controversial episodes of this period involves our character Harold Godwinson, who is said to have sworn an oath to support William's claim to the English throne in 1064. The sources on this are very much divided between English and Norman accounts. I think everyone was trying to put forward their own propaganda. According to the Norman sources, at least, Harold was sent on an official mission to reaffirm William's claim, while the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the main contemporary English source, does not mention the event for that year. According to the Norman version, Harold was captured by Count Guy de Ponthieu, a defeated participant in a rebellion against William, and was handed over to William. William then extracted an oath, reportedly, from Harold to support his claim to the English throne. The Bayeux Tapestry, another important Norman source, simply states that Harold swore a pledge, with the official Norman story suggesting he reaffirmed his loyalty to William. It is possible that he swore this oath voluntarily to secure the future under potential King William for him and his family. However, later English sources argue that the oath was made under pressure and therefore should not be considered valid. Regardless of these circumstances, when Edward the Confessor died on January the 4th, 1066, Harold seized the throne for himself, disregarding any prior oath to William. Edward had named Harold as his successor, either on his own accord or under pressure from Harold, but no one suggested making Edgar Atheling the king. Harold, with the backing of the king's advisors as well as the Witan, that would have been the Council of Nobles, quickly took the crown, leading to the conflict that would culminate in the Battle of Hastings later that year. As soon as Harold took the English throne, William of Normandy began planning his invasion. He needed military, political support, particularly from European nobles as well as the Pope. He did send envoys to Rome, arguing that Harold had broken the oath and promising to reform the English church. So the Pope did endorse him, reportedly giving him a papal banner. Meanwhile, Harold's estranged brother Tostig conspired against him and allied with Harald Hardroda of Norway, who had a tenuous claim to the English throne as well. They invaded Northumbria, defeated the local forces. However, Harald Godwinson quickly marched north and crushed them at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, killing both Tostig and Harold. However, this left him exhausted and far away from the south, just as William's fleet landed in Sussex unopposed. William fortified Hastings and pillaged the countryside to weaken English resistance. Harold rushed south to confront William instead of waiting for supplies, so on October 14th, the two armies clashed at the Battle of Hastings. Harold's forces held a strong defensive position initially on a ridge with a shield wall. So the Norman attacks actually failed initially, but then rumors apparently spread that William had failed. So to restore morale, he would have removed his helmet and rallied his troops. The English then lost their advantage when some soldiers broke formation to chase retreating Normans. So it is possible that William exploited this whole situation by staging a feigned retreat. Harold was ultimately killed, likely by an arrow or a spear, sealing William's victory. And the battle marks, as you probably know, the Norman conquest of England. So now with this broad historical context in mind, let's have a look at the latest archaeological discoveries surrounding Anglo-Saxon and Norman England. So what happened is that the lost residence of Harold, so one of his most important manors, was finally confirmed in the landscape. This is part of the project Where Power Lies. So it's a team from Newcastle and Exeter, and the project is very important because it essentially challenges traditional narratives about elite power centers in England from 800 to 1200. It critiques the dominant focus on castles and instead explores a broader range of aristocratic sites, including pre-conquest noble residences, religious complexes, integrated within these sites, as well as non-military administrative buildings. Many pre-Roman power structures persisted or evolved, that's the conclusion of the project, rather than being completely wiped out after the Battle of Hastings. So the Norman conquest did bring change, but it also built upon existing patterns of power consolidation. The study uses archaeological, historical, and landscape data to systematically analyze centers across two case study regions in England. Southwest, with sites such as Devon, Dorset, Hampshire, Somerset, and northeast, with sites such as Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. Early medieval aristocrats usually derived power from kinship and military service, so essentially you have to prove yourself worthy of a fellowship, you have to prove that you were capable of winning battles. But by the 10th century, wealth and estate ownership became dominant markers of status. In other words, you had to be wealthy, financially speaking. And this is beautifully shown by the evolution of the Old English word rike, so rich, which originally meant powerful, but with the passage of time came to denote wealth. So elite residences, as a consequence, became more complex, often incorporated churches, enclosures, and water features. These were not only castles, they were rather multifunctional estates with halls, chapels, mills, and economic centers. Castles are often seen as the defining feature of Norman rule, but this study argues that many lordly sites continued from the Anglo-Saxon period. Rather than complete replacement, the Normans refashioned existing elite centers, reinforcing control by integrating castles into pre-existing power networks. The expansion of churches and monastic institutions was a key part of this aristocratic power, both before and after the conquest. What Normans did was to intensify feudal structures. However, rural centers remained deeply tied to what was going on before the Norman conquest. The study identified no fewer than 870 aristocratic residences. Many of these sites were built near churches, reinforcing the fusion between secular and religious power. One third of these centers were within 250 meters of a church. This suggests that noble families were closely involved in the local religious life. Water features were also crucial. 37% of the sites were within 250 meters of a stream or a river. Many had associated mills. The suit of the mill custom, where peasants had to grind their grain at their lord's mill for a fee, became very widespread after the Norman conquest. Settlement density influenced site distribution. Lordly centers were not exclusive to densely populated areas, but were common in rural, dispersed landscapes as well. And now let's have a look at the residence of our friend Harald Godwinson. Bosham is located in West Sussex, and it would have been one of his chief residences before the Roman conquest. It is unique because it is the only Anglo-Saxon noble estate depicted on the Bayeux Tapestry, marking it an important pre-conquest power center. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle also mentions Bosham as a naval base for the Godwin family. In 1049, for example, it is said that Earl Godwin used the harbour here to gather ships for a military campaign. And then there is also an entry in 1051 where a political crisis is mentioned, leading to Godwin's exile. And then Bosham was involved in his departure and later returned to power. These references highlight Bosham's role both as a political hub and military hub, reinforcing its importance beyond just an aristocratic residence. The tapestry shows two key scenes at Bosham depicting Harold's movements before and after his fateful journey to Normandy in 1064. He is shown arriving at Bosham. He seems to attend church and feasting in a grand hall, and this would emphasize Bosham's feudal function, like combining secular power, religious patronage, as well as hospitality. And then he's also shown departing by ship, sailing from Bosham's harbor to Normandy. His return is also likely depicted, showing a fortified entrance with two towers, one of which appears to be a kind of watchtower and a gatehouse where people look out to sea. This depiction suggests that Bosham was not only a residential estate, but also a key coastal defense and surveillance area. The site was actually already excavated in 2006, and the excavation back then showed that the surroundings pointed out to crucial physical evidence supporting the tapestry's depiction. But only this research nowadays, expanding on the previous one, actually confirmed this. And this was done using new methods such as ground penetrating radar, as well as standing building analysis and topographic modeling. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of key findings from the excavations. First of all, we have the latrine and timber building dating back to the 10th or the 11th century. A late Saxon latrine was discovered, likely connected to a high status timber hall, and this would align with the known Anglo-Saxon aristocratic residential structures where latrines were attached to the upper floor chambers. And this would strongly indicate that we are dealing with a major noble residence. We also have enclosure ditches. Excavations revealed two major ditches, which likely formed part of the enclosure system of the estate. The western boundary of the complex was defined by a mill lead, that would be an artificial water channel, reinforcing the economic importance of the site. The manor house was directly connected to a church, the Holy Trinity Church. This again supports the idea that secular and religious authority were very much intertwined. A large post hole suggests that a bridge or causeway linked the estate to the church, and this actually aligns to the with the depiction on the tapestry where Harold prays at the church exactly before departing. After 1066, Bosham remained important but underwent significant changes under Norman rule. A ruined stone structure west of the manor house was previously assumed to be post medieval, but it is now believed to date back to the 12th or 13th century. It features a narrow lancet window, characteristic of early medieval elite buildings, suggesting it may have been a first floor hall, a common feature in Norman noble residences. We also have a chamber block serving as a private space for the lord and a possible mill building. The current manor house dates back to the 17th century, but a medieval stone wall within it suggests it was built on earlier fortifications. This continuity shows that Bosham essentially remained very significant for centuries after the Norman conquest. So I think the most important point of this whole research is to show the complexity of such residences. Bosham was not just a residence, but it was also a key economic and naval center. The presence of the mill elite suggests Bosham's economic power relied on milling operations. Controlling milling was a major source of income, reinforcing aristocratic dominance over local communities. The watercourse also likely played a defensive role, forming a sort of natural barrier on one side of the estate at least. And then we have the harbour and the fleet, absolutely central to the Godwinsons family's military power. It provided an essential departure point for Harold's diplomatic missions, including the journey to Normandy from 1064. This role diminished after the Norman conquest and centralization. However, the coastal position ensured it remained strategically relevant. So Bosham essentially exemplifies how pre-conquest noble estates functioned as integrated power hubs. They would have combined military, economic, and religious elements, and that very much challenges the view that castles were the sole centers of power after 1066. Anglo-Saxon elite power structures were sophisticated, they were complex, they were durable, and they also influenced post-conquest aristocracy. And they were not just these simple noble estates that automatically lost all of their influence after Hastings. On the contrary, they very much adapted or were adapted. If you enjoyed this topic, you should watch my video on the magnificent fortifications of Harold Bluetooth and their political significance. And generally subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the video. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. This was Irina. Take care, and till next time.